I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as well as the latest updates from Ukraine, we look at the story of how the citizens of Kryvyi Rih saved their city from Russian forces in the early days of the invasion. And we dive into the issues facing both sides in the air war and ask what the West needs to do to support Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 7th of November, day 257. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, who's live from Kharkiv, and Dr. Justin Bronk. He's the Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology in the Military Sciences team at RUSI. I started by asking Dom for the latest from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hi everybody. The lines were fairly static over the weekend, but that's not to say there wasn't a huge amount of activity and violence across the lines, mainly artillery-led and missile-led. There are reports from numerous Russian telegram channels that a lot of mobilised Russian forces have been killed, complete units wiped out. These are messages from the very small number of survivors going back to their loved ones in Russia. Again, as we've often said, got to be careful with these telegram channels. Never take them at face value, but there were a sufficient number of these to lend credibility to that. That would speak of the poor level of training and equipment that mobilised Russian forces have got along those lines. They seem to be just pushed in there to hold the line. To either in the south around Kherson, we think they are backfilling to enable the sort of better trained and experienced units to come out of Kherson city. But around the Donbass, we think that they're just holding the line and just holding up that advance, the push, Ukraine's push through to Savatove, that main town, that big logistic hub on the road down into the Donbass. So a lot of violence, a lot of people being killed there from Russian mobilised forces, we think. Also, suggestions today, UK Defence Intelligence is saying that Russia has lost a significantly higher rate of aircraft than it can replace. Their words, significantly higher. They're assessing about 300 aircraft. This chimes with what General Zaluzhny, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, said recently. He said last week, actually, that Russia had lost 278 aircraft. That was more than double the 119 that Russia lost through the whole of their Afghan campaign. And the UK Defence Intelligence is suggesting that that's the lack of air superiority exacerbated by the loss of experienced crews and poor maintenance that's led to that loss. We're going to speak in a minute to Justin. Be fascinating to hear him talk about that. Another update to just be aware of: on Saturday, Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's Minister of Defence, he put out in a tweet that there's the latest military aid package from the US, another $400 million. This is going to refurbish Hawk air defence missiles. They're old, but kind of good. They sort of do what they say on the tin. Also going to refurb 45 T-72B tanks, mainly by provision of advanced optics. They're also going to supply 1,100 Phoenix Ghost drones, these super secret drones. I say super secret because we've never actually seen a picture of them. We've been trying to chase up what these things are for months now. But we think they are loitering munitions that are then able to, that also have a warhead, so are then able, once they've picked a target of interest, the operator has seen, are they going for air defence or radars or tanks or command headquarters, whatever, they can, once they've seen what they want, they can direct the drone to go and destroy that location. And that seems to be where the edge of sort of smaller drones, smaller unattended air vehicle technology seems to be. Also, the $400 million is going to provide 400 armoured riverine boats. So very interesting if we're thinking about what might happen as and when Kherson is taken back by the city, is taken back by Ukraine. So to have a military effect along the Dnipro River there, these boats will come in hugely handy for that. And then also low comms, training, maintenance and support. But another big chunk of money there that Alexei Reznikov is lauding. And the only other thing I'll mention is Ukraine's ambassador to UK, Vadim Pristaiko, he's been speaking to Sky News this morning, and he says that his main concern are the huge number of Shahed 136, these Iranian drones, not loitering drones. They are effectively, I mean, they're low, slow, quite noisy. They have about a 50 kilogram warhead, but so quite effective. Although a lot of them are being shot down, but they seem to be leading Russia's recent push to degrade Ukraine's civil infrastructure and their power infrastructure. Mr. Pristaiko is saying that he's very concerned about a huge number of these aircraft, these drones that are being held in Belarus, possibly, obviously, bringing Kyiv into range. But hopefully more of that later with Justin. I'll take a pause there.
Thank you very much, Dom, for that. Joe Barnes, you're in Kharkiv. Can you give us a sense of what life is like on the ground there? What have you been looking at?
Hi, folks. Yes, here in Kharkiv, the northeastern second city of Ukraine. So kind of depends where you're based, 20 to 30 miles away from the Russian border. And it's probably the first place I've been to in Ukraine where the war kind of feels quite close in the fact while the war isn't close, actually lots of the shops are still boarded up. There is still lots of kind of missile-scarred buildings, and the lack of kind of, not atmosphere is the wrong word, but a lack of people actually roaming the streets. I know it's very cold here now. We're kind of at between kind of like 3 and 4 degrees during the day, so people probably prefer to stay off the streets. But just during a brief walk round, just not a lot seems open. So whereas unlike in Kyiv and other places you can buy a McDonald's or a KFC, you can't do that here. I went to try and buy some water supplies from a local supermarket, and that was also boarded up as well around the corner from my hotel. So it just feels a bit more like a ghost town than anywhere else we've been on this trip so far.
And what kind of stories have you been looking at over the past few days? You've been travelling across Ukraine. What have you seen?
So I'll start with what we had published in the Sunday Telegraph. And it's quite an intriguing story about a pro-Russian politician, a history lesson from his uncle, and a dozen cement mixers, and how that kind of bizarre concoction helped to save the city of Kryvyi Rih from falling into Russian hands. So it's a story about Alexander Vilko, who is himself, he's been quite a successful politician. He served as a deputy prime minister once. He was a governor of Dnipro-Petrovsk, which is the kind of region where where Kryvyi Rih is. But on February the 24th, he didn't hold any political position. So kind of as missiles were raining down on his city, which is probably, we can consider it a bit of a gateway between kind of Kyiv and the east. So when we met at kind of a secretive location, he had a map scrawled out in front of him, and he kind of pointed out that if Kryvyi Rih had fallen, it would have given the Russians a bit more of a staging kind of post to encircle the east of the country, to then potentially move and encircle Kyiv. But what was intriguing was that he was telling me about his story, and I then went to speak to a lot of other people about this, because you kind of obviously you want to be careful and make sure people aren't self-promoting too much. Everyone kind of backed it up, and he was basically the city's deputy mayor. Gave him a call in the early hours as they were both woken up by the sound of kind of missiles raining down on their country, and they all went to meet in the mayor's office, who is Alexander's dad, Yuri. And kind of over the kind of time it took for Alexander to light a cigarette, to smoke it, he had basically come up with a plan to protect the city, which didn't have any significant kind of manpower in it. It had 600 volunteers with 2 mortars. I can't remember. He didn't say what size the mortars were, but that's not enough to stop a kind of an advancing army. And they had no like serious vehicles. They were just kind of volunteers, probably illy trained, with rifles each. So they didn't have enough to protect the city from a Russian invasion. But basically what he kind of deduced over the time that he'd smoked this cigarette, so he suggested that everyone should pour out all of the machinery they could find on the streets. And Kryvyi Rih is known as the steel heart of Ukraine. It's got these vast kind of open iron ore pits, which would probably be the size of Monaco, some of the larger ones. It has these massive kind of steel producing factories. So they've got loads of this kind of vast machinery kind of sitting around. And he basically told people to drag out as many of these cement mixers and kind of dumper trucks and lorries and buses that they could find and block the runway. And people were kind of like questioning, why are you doing this? Why? And he went back to a story that his uncle had told him. His uncle was a former Soviet Union military pilot. And it was about how the Soviets managed to capture the Czechoslovakia in 1968 when they invaded. And he basically told the story about how the main airport in Prague was captured at 5 a.m. by a Russian flight from Moscow carrying kind of special forces, which had got over Prague and said, look, we need to land. We've got engine failure. And then as soon as they landed, they kind of took over the airport, secured it, and made room kind of for big transporter planes to kind of bring in tanks and artillery pieces to help the ground assault. And so Alexander basically told this story and said that, look, the Soviet army captured 5 airports in Czechoslovakia and ultimately captured the country. So his basically message was that let's block our airport and make sure the Russians cannot land, use it to land and kind of capture our city. And so they trusted Alexander. He's like a kind of a well-respected guy in Kryvyi Rih. He held kind of high-ranking positions in kind of local industry boards where like they would liaise, like basically not quite unions, but like kind of civic boards that would kind of liaise with the government to help the steel and mining industries there. So and then on the first day of the war, so February 24th, it pans out. No kind of planes decide to land. A pitter and patter of rain kind of filled the air. The sound of missiles and kind of artillery from around filled the air, but no planes turned up. Then on the second day, suddenly this Russian transporter plane, which they believe was loaded with paratroopers, escorted by 2 fighter jets, was spotted barreling towards their city. But as Alexander described it to me, they had to descend for a real thick cloud of fog that kind of enveloped the city. So the Russian pilot only realised that the runway had been completely blocked off when he was about 200 metres from the ground. So it was basically had to make a kind of an emergency pull up and kind of abort that landing, which ultimately stopped a team of Russian paratroopers, as described to me, landing in Kryvyi Rih. And then the next move was Alexander ordered these giant kind of, and they're 3 or 4 stories tall, mining kind of trucks. And what they do is they basically drive from the bottom of the mine to the top with about 100 tons worth of kind of dust, rubble and soil for the iron ore to be extracted from the mine in these plants. And they were basically placed on all of the roads into Kryvyi Rih. Any other road that roads, bridges that couldn't be blocked off, they used kind of detonation charges which were found in the mines to destroy them, to basically stop. And basically they kind of hailed their good luck at that point because the rains had started to fall. The ground alongside the roads were completely kind of bogged down, so no tank would be able to really move through it with any efficiency. And then eventually a Russian tank convoy did kind of try and enter Kryvyi Rih, but they got stuck behind these huge yellow dumper trucks, which kind of weigh 250 tons and sit about 4 stories off the ground when they're full. And the Russians didn't know what to do. So Alexander decided to call a local military contact he knew, and the Ukrainians eventually created this kind of cauldron effect where they shot the rear and the front tank of this convoy, forcing the Russians to basically flee on foot, knowing their time would be up very quickly if they decided to stay sitting in their tanks. And this is what spawned one of the first images of Russian tanks being dragged and towed by Ukrainian farmers. Because basically, after the Russians had fled, the Ukrainian farmers went out and hauled this kind of treasure trove of tanks and artillery pieces into Kryvyi Rih. And then another kind of great bit of luck would be had it one of the guys that worked in the kind of an older gentleman that worked in the military planning office in Kryvyi Rih, happened to be a former artilleryman, so he could help kind of train some people up. And the next time a kind of Russian tank convoy moved on Kryvyi Rih in March time, they were fired on by their own ammunition and their own tanks, their own artillery, in a battle that eventually saw them push some 50 kilometers back from the town. And I just think it's a really fascinating story. So the guy Alexander Vilko is not pro-Russian as in pro-Putin. He was once in favour of kind of closer ties between Ukraine and Russia. He didn't believe that Ukrainian should be the country's only official language. He thought Russian should play a part, because a vast chunk of that part of the world does speak Russian, and many of them people there spoke Russian as their first language. It's now kind of changed, and people have made a genuine effort to ensure they only speak Ukrainian there, which is quite fascinating. But that's probably for another day. So I think that was a really interesting story, and I'll stop there for that one.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Joe. Dom, can I just ask you, from a military perspective, what are your reactions to the story that Joe's told us of the citizens of Kryvyi Rih coming together and essentially improvising their defence, which seems to have paid off?
Well, I think it's fascinating. It speaks of the culture we've seen in Ukraine for the last few months last few years, but since February 24th, of improvisation, improvise, adapt, and overcome, the old mantra. I mean, it's fascinating. Look at some of the things they're doing. It's fairly low level stuff. Parking these. I mean, I know these dumper trucks are massive, as Joe says, 4 stories high, 250 tons, but it's quite a simple tactic to block the runway. But it's the doing it. It's someone pulling these ideas together, and then everyone else, with every instinct in their body, every fibre saying, "Oh, this could end badly. I've got my family to think about, etc., etc." But people come together to say, "Yeah, it's only going to work if we all lean in." I think it's absolutely fascinating. It does speak of the societal endurance and resilience, and it also shows how even great military machines can be defeated quite simply. For those who have access to the BBC iPlayer, there's a fascinating, I think, 7-part thing on Russia at the moment about it's called Trauma Zone. It charts Russia from 1985 to 99, when it all sort of collapsed at the end of the Cold War. But in there, it was showing that in the revolution, or the would have liked to have been a revolution in 91, when largely held back by Boris Yeltsin. I mean, the Russian civilians were adopting tactics that they'd seen used against them by Afghan mujahideen, by just getting large bits of tarpaulin and draping them over the tanks attacking central Moscow, and just denying the soldiers inside the ability to see where they're going. It completely wiped out that military capability. So things like this. It's all very good having anti-tank guided missiles and all the rest of it, and they're terrific, believe me. But there are many things that civilians can do. We've seen these porcupines, the big sort of tripod structures that are welded together to stop vehicles moving. We've even seen just buses. If you put them together, imagine a street. We've got some tanks coming down the street. You want to stop those tanks. All you've got is a couple of just civilian buses. If you point them nose to nose, but not sort of directly across the street, tank will just roll through that. But put them in a kind of crescent, a V-shaped formation pointing towards the tank. Very, very difficult to get through that, unless the vehicle can get over the top, which they not all of them can. I mean, there are some very low level things, actually quite simple things to do that civilians can do if they know how to. And this is why we need to get John Spencer on the pod, because he's produced the Urban Handbook for how people can do this sort of thing. But yes, it's fascinating what can be done at a very low level with just a little bit of thought, a little bit of application and innovation, and then everyone deciding, yeah, I'm going to take my chances and lean in, and let's all go together.
Thanks, Dom. I know you had a quick question for Joe as well.
Yeah, Joe, hi. Great to hear from you. I just wondered if you could react to some breaking news I'm charting here, 25 minutes old, of reports of mine explosions along the border, the Ukraine-Russia border in the north, sort of northeast of Chernihiv, north of Sumy. There's reports that on the Russian side of the border, there's been a number of mine explosions, or at least 2, either separate incidents or 2 mines at the same incident. I think it's probably 2 separate incidents. which there's suggestions that soldiers and FSB officers have been badly injured driving over anti-tank mines, that they are either the mine layers have put them in the wrong place, or it's bad drills by the border guards. But I just wonder, you're up in Kharkiv and looking at that sort of that border there against Russia. Can you just give us a feel for what's happening there? Has Ukraine had to hold a lot of forces there to prevent any further incursions, or just what's the mood, what's the feel for any further advances from Russia back across the border?
Unfortunately, Dom, I think Joe's just messaged me to say he didn't actually hear that question, as the Wi-Fi is a little bit dodgy up in Kharkiv.
Yeah, sorry about that, Dom. The Wi-Fi is a bit unpredictable here, I presume because the power is not 100% stable all the time, but that's kind of what I'll speak about now. Is one of the main stories that I've looked at while travelling through Ukraine is how people are going to cope with the winter. As I mentioned earlier, it's 3 or 4 degrees outside at the moment. It's bitterly cold for me, but I'm now sat inside a kind of a warm hotel room, shielded from the elements. But many people across Ukraine don't have that kind of luck on their side. So, for instance, when we were in Zaporizhia a while ago, and we visited a housing estate that was hit by a Russian S-300 rocket or missile at the beginning of October in the first week. People died in the hit. It was a big kind of news story, which received a lot of attention at the time there. But so we then travelled back just about a month later to see what people were doing in that area and how people were living. And we kind of realised a lot of people had moved out, but some people didn't have the same kind of fortune and the ability to move out. One lady, Eleanor, because she basically had her elderly mother-in-law to look after and couldn't physically move her that easily. There was another chap called Serhiy. He had lived in the apartment block for 50 years and basically said the attack had made him more resolute than ever, but he didn't want to give up what he had lived with for 50 years. Then we met another chap called Anatoly. He had actually escaped from occupied territory, moved that. So he had escaped from Russian occupied territory, that kind of the hell that we've heard of those stories there, moved to this apartment block, only for it to kind of the war to land on his doorstep again. And they were living so Serhiy was outside, he was cooking his pork shashlik kebabs on an open fire pit because none of the building had gas. They had intermittent electricity. Many of the windows were blown out. So you have to think what it's going to be like for the people of Ukraine as they come in to kind of the really bitter cold winter months. And so November, December doesn't actually start to really get really cold. It's kind of January, February, March time when you'll have snow on the ground and it'll be well into the minuses and sub-zero temperatures. So there's real questions from a lot of these people that, well, they hear lots of promises from the West, lots of promises from the Ukrainian government about being given new homes, new places to live, new windows, but actually that support probably isn't coming fast enough for some. And so it's not a damning criticism on the Ukrainian government because they have a hell of a lot to clean up. But there are going to be kind of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that are living in kind of war-torn, war-scarred, battle missile-wrecked apartment blocks in some of the coldest months, kind of winters that Britain couldn't dream of. So that's where I kind of think I leave it there for my thoughts of the week, as there are lots of people kind of living in these hellish conditions, and my voice is about to go because I've been suffering from a bit of a cold myself. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for joining us, and hope you do feel better soon. Justin Bronk, you've just published a fascinating paper on the air war and what you think, what RUSI thinks Ukraine needs to do now, how the West needs to support Ukraine. I just want to pick you up on something you mentioned kind of early on. Your paper suggests that the air war was much more closely fought at the beginning of the war than generally has been reported. Could you give us an account of that? How so?
Sure. So essentially, what happened in the first couple of days of the war was that Russian electronic attack using electronic warfare equipment was very effective at degrading and jamming a lot of Ukrainian radars. And in addition, the large barrages of cruise and ballistic missiles on Ukrainian air defense positions particularly forced a lot of the surviving systems to move urgently to avoid being hit. And that meant that essentially Russian fixed-wing aircraft were able to conduct quite deep strike penetration sorties up to about 300 kilometers inside Ukrainian-controlled airspace, around 100 to 140 sorties a day for the first 3 days, while Ukrainian air defenses on the ground were kind of regrouping, repositioning, and trying to reset damaged equipment and repair things. During those first 3 days, therefore the Ukrainian Air Force, in terms of the fighter aircraft, were trying to hold the line in terms of defending Ukrainian airspace more or less on their own. And while they had some significant isolated successes from flying very, very low, exploiting the terrain, and the fact that they've been training for these sort of operations for a long time, to try and get underneath Russian radar coverage and kind of ambush Russian strike packages from below. The Ukrainian Air Force took really quite serious losses in those 3 days, and the message was kind of, we can't do that again. It's not sustainable because of the huge technical overmatch that Russian aircraft have compared to Ukrainian fighters, particularly in terms of radar and missile reach. Once the Ukrainian ground-based air defenses started to really come back online from kind of the third day onwards, Russian medium and high altitude penetrating sorties across Ukraine started to become pretty quickly unsustainable. And so they switched to very low level attacks for kind of the first week of March. That led to unsustainable losses to short range shoulder fired manpads, so man portable air defense systems. So then they tried to fly by night, although only a very small portion of their fleet, the Sukhoi 34 fullbacks, the fighter bombers, really had any training for that sort of low-level night attack mission set. So it was already a very reduced part of the Russian strike fleet that could be used. And even there, once the Ukrainians started to get night vision equipment to their manpads operators, that became pretty costly as well. But so the kind of message I would highlight from that is there was a lot more Russian strike activity than we saw in terms of fixed wing Air Force strike operations at the beginning of the war, and their fighters were very effective and have been throughout, even though they've been forced to stand off since the ground-based air defenses got back online. And so if we don't keep up supply of ammunition and ultimately replacement systems for those Ukrainian medium-range and short-range SAM systems, things like SA-11 Buk or SA-8 OSA, then there's nothing to stop at that point the Russian Air Force suddenly becoming much more effective than it's been up to now. And we sort of glimpsed what that could look like in the first few days, albeit in those first few days, the Air Force were also going after Ukrainian air defense systems. And so they were limited in some ways by the slow nature of their targeting process. They were often hitting quite accurately positions that had already been vacated. But if you were to read that across to attacks on infrastructure or attacks on static frontline positions, these days, it's a real threat. And so, having focused very strongly on the ground war in terms of equipment provision up to now for very good reasons, it's important the West doesn't get complacent and now prioritizes resupplying and ultimately replacing those Ukrainian medium-range SAMs, because the Air Force on its own won't be able to keep the Russian Air Force out of Ukrainian skies if those SAMs run short of ammo or are slowly attrited.
Well, this is fascinating. Thank you, Justin. I know Dom's got lots of questions. I just want to ask, you've sketched a fascinating picture of the early days and weeks of the conflict. Can you just give us a sense of what it looks like at the moment? What are the tactics and the strategies being employed? And it sounds as if really the Ukrainian Air Force is on top. Is that fair?
To be honest, I wouldn't characterize it that way. So I would say there's a significant degree of mutual denial in terms of the ability to effectively use air power for close air support on the front lines. Neither the Ukrainian Air Force has taken really significant losses, particularly in early October, trying to be more aggressive about conducting airstrikes on Russian positions, particularly down south in Kherson, because not only are Russian ground-based air defenses still strong, despite the use of AGM-88, the high-speed anti-radiation missile, which has attrited Russian radars to some degree and forced them to operate in a safer but more kind of less effective manner. But what the Russian Air Force is spending most of its time in terms of sortie rates now doing is they've divided up the kind of lines of contact into 8 different air defense zones, and they maintain a combat air patrol of at least 2 fighters in each of those, pretty much all through daylight and sometimes in the night as well. with primarily Sukhoi 35, so one of their air superiority fighters, and MiG-31BM, which is this rather unique Russian, very large long-range interceptor. Both of them are equipped with very powerful long-range radars capable of picking out low-flying aircraft against clutter from a long distance, and also with both R-77, which is the standard Russian Air Force long-range active radar missile, which comfortably outranges, even in a sort of even confrontation, the R-27s that the Ukrainians are equipped with. But also the Russians are able to fly high and fast at some distance behind their own front lines, which means that their missiles start out with a lot of energy, whereas the Ukrainians, because of the Russian fighter patrols and the ground-based air defense, the Russian ground-based air defense near the front lines, have to approach the front very, very low. So their missiles, even if they had a comparable missile, are starting out with much, much less energy, so they will go much less far. The Russians are also using a lot of a very long-range air-to-air missile called R-37. And essentially what that's done is push back the ability of the Ukrainians to sustainably fly sorties, even at very low altitude, to the front lines. They're still trying, but they're taking significant losses, and it's not really sustainable there. But equally, the Russians are concentrating on trying to slowly and steadily attrit those Ukrainian SAMs that are preventing Russian aircraft from sustainably operating near the front lines. If they operate low level, there's a lot of kind of standoff rocket lobbing. That's essentially just airborne artillery. It's not a precise form of attack. It's relatively safe for the Russians to do, certainly. But it essentially, what the Russians can't do is what they did in Syria at the moment, which is kind of tote around at medium altitude, taking their time to identify targets and then relatively accurately dropping sticks of unguided bombs. They can't do that because the Ukrainian SAMs are still there. What Ukrainian fighters are spending most of their time doing at the moment is hunting cruise missiles and Shaheeds in the interior, which they are having some success with, but again, they need resupplies of particularly short-range air-to-air missiles, their R-73s.
Justin, you mentioned the missiles that the Russian jets are using, and also the point of your paper really is to say that we should provide more supplies to the Ukrainians. Can I just ask? We know that the Russians are running low on other ballistic stocks. Is that something that's affecting? Do we know if that's something that's affecting the Air Force as well? Is that could we see in the future the Russian Air Force run out of the missiles that they use, or is that just something we don't know?
So the Russians may be having difficulties with some of their, in terms of stockpiles, with some of their air-launched precision-guided munitions, particularly standoff ones. So they've been using a lot of their something called KH-29, both T and L, so TV and laser-guided versions. That's been one of the mainstays of their Sukhoi 34 fleet's standoff attacks on fixed targets near the lines, as well as larger things like KH-59, which is an air-launched cruise missile. On the other hand, they have enormous quantities of unguided rockets and bombs, so they can continue to use those where they're able to get access for an extremely long period of time. We have seen an increase in recent weeks in the Sukhoi 34 fleet, so really high-end fighter bombers, conducting unguided bombing raids at low level on Ukrainian frontline positions. That would support the theory that they're running relatively low on KH-29 and 59, because there have been significant losses in the KH-34 fleet, so in the Sukhoi 34 fleet, 17 or 18 confirmed of the 135 or so that they started the war with. So they're probably keen to avoid risking them to ground fire, particularly man-pads, but also anti-aircraft fire, if they can. And the fact that they are having to do so anyway suggests, maybe they're running a bit short on certain air-to-ground guided munitions. On the other hand, the fact that they've expanded the use of R-37, so that this very, very long-range air-to-air missile, from the core MiG-31 fleet, where it's the standard armament, to also a portion of the Su-35 fleet, suggests they're not particularly worried about stockpiles of R-37, because if they were, they probably would keep that for the specialist platform that is the MiG-31. So I don't think the Ukrainian Air Force is going to be delivered by the Russians suddenly running out of that stuff.
Justin, hi, Dom here. Thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Fascinating stuff. It's really good that we're able to have a deep dive into all things air power, air defence. In your paper, you talk about the actions the West should be encouraged to take. By the West, I mean those external supporters, obviously not just countries in the West, not just NATO, but countries all leaning in to supply military aid for Ukraine. limited by everyone's limited by money, bandwidth, political bandwidth, etc., etc. So where would you say the priority is? Is it facing that lack of offensive capability? You talk about the need for F-16s, F-18s, Gripen to lead on the offensive capability, or defensive, the need for more man-pads, self-propelled anti-air guns, and so on and so forth. Given where we are at the war at the moment, where would you suggest external support looks to lean in as a priority?
So I would divide it more by deliverable time frame as opposed to particularly offensive or defensive. I think actually the priorities in the air domain are pretty much exclusively defensive, including fighters. So the biggest priority, as we've already heard today from yourself, is clearly the getting on top of the Shaheeds, the Iranian loitering munitions being supplied in large numbers. Because they're cheap enough and usable in large enough numbers that Russia can very effectively use them to kind of bolster its relatively limited remaining stocks of cruise missiles, and particularly things like the Iskander 9M 723 and 720 ballistic missiles for this counter-infrastructure campaign. Previous iterations of the Russian long-range strike campaign have essentially floundered on insufficient concentration of firepower. So they tried to go after Ukrainian communications capabilities, Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian industry, defense industry, Ukrainian fuel infrastructure. None of them really, they were never able to achieve lasting and decisive damage because Russia just doesn't have the stocks of these expensive cruise and ballistic missiles. But in this latest iteration, since essentially the second week of October, they've been mixing very effectively those higher-end cruise missiles and ballistic missiles against large infrastructure targets, where those larger warheads are much more useful. So things like large power stations, interconnectors, large water treatment plants, hydroelectric plants, and then using the hundreds of Shaheeds to target all of the smaller stuff where, frankly, they just don't have the numbers of cruise missiles to cover the whole country. So they're using the Shaheeds to hit substations, small pumping stations, infrastructure in terms of things like office blocks where infrastructure offices are based, and so it's providing them a much more sustainable and therefore dangerous campaign. So in the very short term, clearly the West needs to send as many manpads, so man-portable air defense systems, as possible. They do work against Shaheeds, mostly from the rear aspect, but they do work. And so to not only resupply the mobile air defense teams that are using them at a significant rate, but also hopefully expand them. Obviously, there are limited stocks left in the West, so this will partly require purchasing from around the world, from countries who might be willing to quietly supply not directly to Ukraine, but via Western intermediaries. More of the self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, modern ones, so things like the German Gepard, which is very effective, both against Shaheeds and in some cases cruise missiles, but there just aren't enough of them. Ideally, gun systems are more sustainable against Shaheeds because individually they're not very hard to shoot down. They're just relatively cheap and usable in large numbers, so expensive missiles aren't really a sustainable answer. Clearly, the supplies of IRIS-T, SLM, and NASAMS, the Western surface-to-air missile systems, are very, very welcome to bolster defense against cruise missiles. But again, Ukraine is a huge country, and not only do the launchers need to be supplied, but also lots of ammo, which is going to be a challenge, but one we have to try and rise to. Less so for NASAMS because it can use AMRAAM, which is the sort of standard Western long-range air-to-air missile. And then in the sort of medium term, we really need to worry about, first of all, getting Ukraine more supplies for their mobile surface-to-air missile systems that they're using near the front lines to keep the Russian Air Force sort of out of the game, if that makes sense. And key there is the supply of Western fighters in the sort of medium term, because so we're talking 3 to 4, 5 months maybe, because we can't keep those SAM systems supplied forever. We don't make the ammunition for a lot of these systems. And there aren't enough Western surface-to-air missile batteries that we could send to cover both the infrastructure in the cities and the frontline areas. The Russian Air Force has been pretty cautious. Wherever there is a significant threat, they've generally been very, very reticent to actually try and destroy it. So even a small number of Western fighters with air-to-air missiles and radars that can meaningfully compete on an even keel with those Russian fighter patrols and threaten Russian strike aircraft from a safe distance would be hugely effective. Clearly, the key is not necessarily training the pilots. The Ukraine has more trained fast jet pilots than they have aircraft, and Western aircraft are generally fairly easy to fly, albeit quite difficult to operate really effectively. But a couple of months of training would probably be sufficient there. The key will be setting up the ground support infrastructure, the maintenance chains, the air bases. Ukraine has kept its air force alive by operating from small, relatively rough, dispersed air bases around the country. And so any Western fighters supplied before there is some sort of ceasefire, and at that point, sure, there'll probably be American aircraft brought in at that point to be the backbone of a future Ukraine.
It sounds from what you're suggesting and what you're saying in the paper that in particular the lack of Russian attack helicopter sorties over the border after the very first few days when they were raiding up to 50 k's inside the lines, this push to hold them over their own lines. It seems as if low technology in great abundance, which might hint at for Western forces, UK in particular, that a huge number of infantry are required, outweighs technical brilliance in the air. Is that fair? And does it speak of a casualty aversion from Russian air power, that they haven't tried to launch multiple ship suppression of enemy air defence and destruction of enemy air defence missions inside Ukraine?
It's quite a bit to unpack in that question. So I think for a start, the thing to emphasise is that manpads only have an effective range of about 10,000 feet and at maximum can only really be pushed up to about 15,000 feet. And even then, not normally against fast jets particularly effectively. So if your Air Force has freedom to operate at medium altitude, as indeed Western fighters have consistently over the last 2 decades in multiple conflicts, manpads just aren't really a defense against them. The issue for the Russian Air Force is that, first of all, they haven't been able to coordinate their different fleets together in large, complex strike packages to, for example, combine strike aircraft. That means the Ukrainian air defenses have to respond, suppression shooters to fire anti-radiation missiles to force the Ukrainian SAMs to then either turn off their radars and reposition or risk being hit. Destruction of enemy air defenses assets to push in and try and actually find and hard kill those SAMs while they're suppressed. With fighters to sweep against any kind of interceptors and perhaps electronic warfare assets. Now, this is how the US and its allies would put together a suppression of enemy air defenses campaign, but the Russian Air Force has never really operated that way. They only really train in 2 ships or occasionally 4 ships, and mostly those training sorties are pretty simple navigation flights, weapons deliveries on unguided ranges, or being practice targets for ground-based air defenses, which is great for the ground-based air defenders, but not great training for fighter pilots. So essentially, they don't really have a lot of the core skills, both in terms of aircrew, but also in terms of planning and senior commanders. They don't know how those sort of operations work, so it's difficult for them to run them. What that means is as long as Ukrainian SAMs continue to function, Russia can only fly low, and at very low level, A, they're vulnerable to the manpads, and B, it's difficult to find, identify, and then accurately hit your targets, because flying at several hundred knots, very, very low level, you only see them for a couple of seconds before you're over them. And so, for now, it speaks to the inability of either the Ukrainian or the Russian Air Force to do what we would see as effective close air support. On the other hand, if the Russian Air Force, even with its deficiencies in close air support, was able to get over the Ukrainian SAMs and could operate at medium level, they would probably have a very decisive shaping impact on the battlefield, even though they can't do kind of exquisite, precise, organic, targeted close air support like Western Air Forces do. For example, the HIMARS, which so far Russia has been unable to find and destroy a single one. If Russian Air Force patrols were able to rove around the battlefield, they would very quickly spot the launch signatures and could then attack those HIMARS, and it would be much, much more difficult for Ukraine to use them effectively. Same for artillery, same for concentrations of forces. So, even without Western sort of high-end multi-role air capabilities, the Russian Air Force could be highly, highly destructive against Ukrainian battlefield and, of course, infrastructure targets if they had more freedom. So it's this mutual denial that's led to the war being very much a ground war so far, and very much more dependent on infantry and massed artillery and UAVs, rather than necessarily speaking to any kind of hitherto unknown truth about the nature of modern war from a Western perspective.
Sure, thanks. Mutual denial sounds like many of the relationships in my life. Before I go, could you just introduce for us, please, the European Sky Shield initiative and offer an opinion on whether or not you think post this war that might come into some future security guarantee for Ukraine short of actual NATO membership?
So, I mean, the difficulty is that it's very, very difficult to put. Well, first of all, you can't put 100% effective air defense system over any country. So, if you the country that's come closest is Israel, where hundreds of billions have been spent, not just on Iron Dome, but Iron Dome sits as one element within a layered defense system that includes both the the air side of things. Even attack helicopters being used as counter UAV shooters with Hellfire. But of course, above Iron Dome, in the ground side of things, you also have David's Sling, you have Patriot. So there's a whole series of layered, incredibly expensive air defense systems there with very, very effective command and control, very well integrated. And Israel is a tiny country, comparatively speaking, with very, very well-known threat directions. They know exactly where they're going to be launched at from particularly from parts of Lebanon as well as the Golan Heights, and obviously from Gaza. And even then, they can't do 100% defense against all rocket attacks, let alone higher-end ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. So when you're looking at a country the size of Ukraine, it's never going to be possible to put 100% protection in place. The question is, what is good enough to outweigh the risk and the cost of Russia embarking on strategic strike campaigns? And so, for example, at the moment, the defenses already in place are working fairly well. You're already seeing more than half the cruise missiles being fired, being shot down. Close between 75 and 85% of most Shahed waves being shot down. The problem is it's not sustainable without more Western support on the air defense side of things at both the high and the low end. And also, of course, that support needs to encompass helping them with the reconstruction so that Russia can't just strike one target and then move on. They have to keep going back and striking the same targets to keep the effect up. So even countries that don't have air defense equipment to potentially either buy and supply or supply directly could help by, for example, supplying spare parts and expertise to help repair Ukrainian power stations, substations, pumping stations, interconnectors, to try and rebuild that resilience. Ultimately, this Russian strike campaign is not going to knock Ukraine out of the war. It's not going to, in itself, reverse the battlefield fortunes. But the key question for how much Western aid we send for the air defense needs in the next couple of months is how many Ukrainian civilians are going to be forced from their homes, but also, just frankly, how many are going to freeze to death over the winter. We can help and we should help more.
Cool. Hi, Justin. Thank you for doing this. Joe in Kharkiv at the moment. I was just wondering if you could enlighten me and probably everyone else listening. There seems to be quite a debate brewing over what to kind of label the Shahed 136 drones. I keep on calling them kamikaze drones, but I notice the kind of the air power experts on Twitter would prefer to call them loitering munitions. Could you kind of describe why we should call them loitering munitions and not drones, using your kind of analysis and expertise, please?
Well, this is a pet peeve of mine, so I'll be very happy to rage against the tide in this case. So essentially, the first thing would be that the Shahed and I've as I'm sure you've seen many, I've seen one blow up quite near me and seen the terminal behavior. I've inspected them in terms of components inside. They're relatively simple things, but ultimately all they are is a propeller-powered missile with slightly larger wings than usual to give it more range. We don't call any other kind of missile kamikaze or suicide, and it would seem absurd to do so. So there's nothing inherently different about the Shahed. I mean, loitering munitions of this class have existed for decades, the Israeli Harpy being the first mass-produced one in the late 80s. And It's only recently that people have started calling them kamikaze drones. Now, the Iranians, annoyingly enough, do call them something similar. The Shahid means martyr. But ultimately, as I say, we don't call any other kind of missile a kamikaze or a suicide missile. For certain parts of the world, particularly in Japan, it's quite disrespectful and offensive, because the kamikaze pilots back in the day were very poorly trained young men, forced, in many cases, even bolted into their cockpits and forced to kill themselves flying into ships in an ultimately totally pointless, suicidal attempt to save their country. So comparing them to a missile that sacrifices nothing is a little disrespectful for some cultures in particular. And ultimately, what differentiates the Shahid and things like the Harap and the Harpy from other missiles is the capacity to loiter. So the ability to circle a target for a while, either until one appears if it's got an anti-radiation seeker, or to circle and then attack at a given time or from a given bearing. So hence focusing on the loitering bit as opposed to anything else. Ultimately, drone munition, I think would be fine. My issue with the term drone is it's a bit like saying vehicle. A drone can encompass anything from a tiny quadcopter that you buy for £5 from Argos, up to multi hundreds of millions of dollar thing the size of a 737, which can fly in the stratosphere and has lethal autonomous attack capabilities and is a stealth aircraft that can cross continents, and only the US flies in the black world. So attempting to use the term drone to describe anything in an analytical context, you can't, because it's too broad a term. It can mean almost anything. It's like saying vehicle, you could refer to a dump truck or a Formula One car. Do you know what I mean?
Thank you very much for that, Justin. I've just got one more question for you. Would you be able to sketch out for us the sort of broad two scenarios following your paper? Firstly, what happens if the West follows what you're writing and supplies Ukraine with what you say it needs? How does the battlefield look in the weeks and months to come if that happens? But also, what happens if this doesn't happen, if they don't get the supplies they need? What happens then?
So on the cruise missile and Shahid front, what happens if they get the additional supplies of urgent supplies of manpads, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, and more ammo and launchers for SAMs, is that a lot of Ukrainians who would otherwise be forced to leave the cities, because of course you can survive much more easily in the countryside than in the cities without electricity or running water, because you can dig wells or you have wells and you can burn firewood, but in the cities that's not doable. So a lot of evacuations and more refugees, if they can't, hold back the tide, as it were. But also, just a lot fewer dead civilians for people who can't move or won't move. A lot of people will freeze to death in their homes this winter if we don't supply them with more air defense capability, and also with components to help repair as much of the damage as possible on an ongoing basis to the power and water grids. But ultimately, Ukraine will keep fighting, and it will just make them more angry and make an eventual settlement even more difficult, because it adds to the sense of complete outrage among all Ukrainians, and rightly so. I mean, the Blitz spirit is still a thing in popular culture in the UK, and that was however long, nearly 80 years ago. This sort of deliberate bombardment of civilians will create very lasting hatred and enormous, in addition to what's already there, and huge casualties. In terms of the supplies to the Ukrainian air defense system more generally, particularly medium SAM ammunition and eventually fighter aircraft, if Ukraine gets them, then the Russian Air Force will largely remain irrelevant. They will simply not be able to exert a shaping influence on the ground campaign. If they don't get them, then there is the danger that suddenly Russia actually starts to gain a much greater degree of access to bombard with a very heavy and quite efficient, so just cheap, unguided bombs in large quantities, Ukrainian positions, units, bases, and infrastructure, as well as cities near the front lines. And that actually could seriously affect the ongoing initiative in the war, which Ukraine has wrestled from the Russians at such cost. If Ukraine is able to maintain its forward air defenses and keep the Russians at bay, then the military momentum on the ground is so one way at this point that Russia faces the likely prospect of being defeated in Ukraine in the spring and the early summer of next year.
Thank you very much, Justin. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is important for our listeners to know or understand? And finally, how can we find this paper? How can we find what you've been writing?
So the paper can be found for free on the RUSI website. It's under if you search RUSI Bronk, it'll pop up under my staff tab. It's also on the RUSI Twitter account, on my Twitter account as well. And it's a RUSI special report. It's called Russia's Air War and Ukrainian Requirements for Air Defense. So you can download the PDF there for free, and there's no paywall or anything. And I think in terms of broader comments, I've probably rambled enough in people's ear for now. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the time.
Not at all. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been absolutely fascinating and really good to do a deep dive on the things you've been working on. Dom Nichols, would you like the final words? Just wondering if you had any reaction to everything that Justin was saying earlier. What's your take on what he said?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of red meat to get through there. I read the paper. It's actually quite short. It's only 46 pages, and it reads very, very easily. So don't be put off by that. I recommend everyone go and have a look at the RUSI website and have a read. It is very interesting, and he's a beefy brain box. He knows his onions, and he is listened to by the government here, the MOD, and elsewhere. So, do pay attention to what he says, because others do. Very interesting arguments about the time for the West somehow to find the mechanism to supply Western, like F-16, 18, Gripen, etc., either through contractors or what have you. But the costs of not doing. But I thought when I was reading the paper, I hadn't realised quite how close run thing it was in those early days. And reading it, I didn't have time to ask him, but it was very clear. We've seen this is the evidence of an idea that we've put forward before, not just us, not claiming it for ourselves, but this idea that Russia invaded with basically three different armies, one in the north, one in the east, one in the south, and then the Air Force doing its own thing. And it was very clear that the Air Force was not coordinated with ground forces. And if you read the paper, that just screams through that it just didn't work on that sort of joint level of military planning. But I just commend everyone to go and have a read of the paper for themselves. Fascinating. For my final thought, I would just say have a look at the G20. G20 starts next Tuesday, and apparently we're going to discover this week whether or not Putin is going to attend personally. I doubt he will, but it'll be really interesting to see what decision he makes. And the reason I doubt he will is because he's very rarely left Moscow or Russia since this phase of the war started, and he's only gone to other places where he's got a passive audience or a friendly crowd. I can't see him going to the G20 with which are 19 of the richest nations and the European Union. I don't think he's going to go there and potentially be snubbed at the photographs and all the rest of it. But I would just keep an eye on that one. So thanks, Joe. I'll end there.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app, and check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.